So this evening we are going to explore some of the more difficult topics at the heart of Dirty John, topics that affect the lives of many women and men too. We will hear new stories that have emerged since the story was published. There have been a lot of women who had their lives turned upside down by John Meehan. And live on stage, we will also have the women who survived Meehan, Deborah Newell and Tanya Bales, plus the young woman who fought Meehan off, Tara Newell. Most importantly, by being here, you are making a difference. $5 from every ticket is going to the nonprofit Peace Over Violence, which works with victims of domestic violence. And so far, that translates to roughly $5,000 for the organization. So thank you so much for being here. It's going to mean a lot to a lot of women. So let's get this started.
Newport Beach 911.
Hi, I'm calling from 1895 Sherrington Place, and there's a man up here with a knife and a girl screaming. They're on the top floor on the north side.
Newport Beach Police, do you have an emergency?
Yeah, we do. We got,
Stabbing west. Is this
come on.
a woman?
Breathe, come on.
You had this a male and a female?
Dude, breathe.
The male's not doing well. Said Westcliff and Dover.
Breathe.
Okay, females there. Hold on 1 second. Hold on 1 second.
Hi, I need an ambulance right away, and the police.
What address?
What's your address? What's the address here? What's the address here? Please tell me what the address is. Someone's been stabbed, and he attacked a girl.
Someone's been stabbed?
Yeah, someone's been stabbed. It's a girl and her dog, and then a guy is on the ground. I'm not really sure what happened. We just heard her screaming.
Do you see blood?
Here. Yes.
Hi, this is Tomoya Shima with the Orange County Register. How are you doing?
Quite well, and you?
Doing well, thank you. Anything interesting going on? Yeah, just checking to see if there's anything interesting going on tonight.
I don't have anything for you.
Got it. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
I guess that's not very interesting. I'd like to welcome back to the stage a two-time Pulitzer finalist, staff writer for the Los Angeles Times, the author of the novel Snitch Jacket, which if you didn't get quite enough noir with this series, this is a good place to start with his work, Christopher Goffard. Welcome back.
Thanks.
So this audio we just heard, a lot of very intense phone calls followed by nothing much happening.
Yeah, you could be forgiven for thinking nothing was going on that day in the idyllic city of Newport Beach, California. I had that job for years where I was on the cop shift, and your job is you call watch commanders and dispatchers and hope that they tell you what's going on. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So I think it underscores the difficulty of a reporter's job. The other thing you hear in that audio is you hear Good Samaritans running to help. We all know the story of Skylar Sepulveda, the 14-year-old junior lifeguard, right? Who saw the stabbing and ran in to help. There were other people who tried to help. After this series ran, I heard from a guy named Pernell Gaston, and he told me that he was walking his dog near the area. He hears Tara screaming, get him away from me, call my mom. He runs up to help, and Meehan is lying there, face down, bleeding. They flip him over, and he says, a woman says, look, we've got to do CPR, we've got to revive him. People are hesitant because he's covered with blood, but this woman puts her mouth right up against his, breathes into his mouth, revives him for a minute, and then when the cops arrive, vanishes. So I don't think she's ever been identified, but there were a number of people who did try and help, but in the chaos of the moment, nobody knew who was who. Nobody knew that he had been the original attacker, at least among the crowd.
Wow. Now, this story starts with the coroner's report. How did you come to it, and what did you see in it that you thought would make a good story?
Well, it started with the coroner's website, and an enterprising reporter for the Daily Pilot named Hannah Fry was working the cop shift that day and came across this death on the coroner's website. It was a homicide in this parking garage. She thought it was probably a suicide, but she made some calls and she broke the story. And somebody calls her, a woman who didn't identify herself, calls her soon after and says, is he really dead? Good riddance. And she finds restraining orders that suggest why she might have said this and point to a larger story. Fast forward a couple months, I'm having lunch with Matt Murphy, the prosecutor that we'll meet tonight. And we're talking about what kind of stories that might be gettable, and he says there's this crazy story out of Newport Beach. We're not going to file charges on it. He says, usually it pains me when there's a homicide, I can't file charges. In this case, I'm delighted. It's the clearest case of justifiable homicide you'll ever see. Because we're closing the case, the coroner's report will be open. Up until then, authorities hadn't been saying much at all. So I run down to the coroner's office, get the report, and what I see is that diagram with 13 stab wounds, right? And this was the first indication to me of just how brutal this confrontation was and just how fiercely Tara fought. So soon after that, I met her. Naturally, I wanted to meet her, and she turned out to be as soft-spoken and docile-seeming and sweet as anybody you'll ever meet. So it just got more and more interesting.
Wow. So tell me a little bit, John Meehan, who was he? And as you went into the story, like, what about him made him such a layered, complicated story?
John Meehan is a drug addict, a con artist, a serial imposter, failed law student, a nurse anesthetist who lost his license because he got hooked on the drugs that he was supposed to be giving patients to relieve their pain and got caught with them. He used his good looks to charm women, and he used his medical knowledge to get drugs. He used his legal knowledge to evade the law in a lot of cases, and he seemed uninhibited by anything like a conscience. He seemed to be a guy who needed to inflict pain on others in the way the rest of us need oxygen.
Wow. Why has this story been so resonant? I mean, you hear from people all over the world about the podcast. Why do you think it's hit so hard right now?
Well, I think toxic masculinity and issues of sexual assault are in the news. There's that. I think, podcast mania too. I mean, there are 400,000 podcasts out there, and there's something about the intimacy of a podcast. You listen to the voices of the people who are living this life and death story. It's an absorbing story, and you feel like they're talking right to you, which I think is part of the allure of podcasts.
Yeah. Which brings us to some fresh stories that have emerged in the wake of Dirty John being released. You've heard from a number of people who were threatened by him, including an ex-girlfriend he had disappeared from her life, and she had always wondered what became of him, and then this podcast comes out.
Yeah, this is Angela Constant, and she says, I ruined her vacation in Maui with her husband because she logs on and she sees this guy that she dated back in the 80s, and she feels like she's been punched in the stomach. Of course, at the same time, she realizes she's dodged a bullet. But she dated him in the early 80s. She was 20, he was 22. She works as a teller in a bank in Los Gatos at the time. He comes in, he's always in his medical scrub. So this is an indication that even back then, he's running this con, and he pretends to be a medical student at Stanford University. And at one point, he leaves a note on her windshield saying, I can't bear not to see you again. Please call me. And she does. And we have some audio of how it unfolds from there.
He took me home very quickly, and I fell for him hard. And he had a skeleton standing in the corner of his bedroom, and that was really creepy. It was one of those anatomical skeletons that you would get if you were in med school, I guess. And it was really weird because It was between the bedroom window and his bed, and it was looking down on his bed. He told me he was in medical school at Stanford. And at that time, I had neither the life experience or a reason to question him.
So I asked his sister about this, and she said that he had a nickname for the skeleton, which was Mr. Bones, and that it was a real skeleton. It was a real cadaver skeleton that he probably stole, she thinks, from a cadaver lab or traded for drugs.
Wow. Now, one of the issues the story raises is that many women in circumstances like this, when they are dealing with a man who's kind of taken over their lives and behaved threateningly, is that they are afraid to come forward because they're afraid no one will believe them. But I mean, part of it goes back to Meehan's seduction of women. Like, how is it that he managed to seduce women in the way that he did?
Well, he'd been practicing for a long time, and in terms of why people didn't come forward, he used shame as a weapon, shame and humiliation. He managed to weaponize them very successfully. He would coax information out of people. He was always data mining. He would coax intimate photos out of people and then use them as a weapon. I talked to a private eye named Nils Gravilius, and he represented a woman who had fallen for Meehan and wanted to know his background because his stories weren't quite adding up. And Nils had some very interesting observations that he came to during the course of his investigation.
One of the things we can't go too light on is the way that a guy gets to be good at this. John Meehan probably responded to hundreds of personal ads. And he learned to hone his approach in the same way that a pitchman at the fair or a telemarketer will base his approach on how many seconds and ultimately minutes he gets to talk to a consumer. What a guy like Meehan is doing is he's constantly tightening up his approach. You know, he knows that surgeon sounds better than nurse anesthetist. He knows that divorced father with a problematic ex-wife and two beautiful daughters sounds way better than I left them in a ditch because I needed to pursue narcotics. These words and this approach that Meehan used didn't just talk these women into doing something that was unwise. He infected them with a persistently bad idea that he loved them and that they could get everything that they wanted emotionally from John Meehan. That he was a cornucopia of emotional goodness for every one of them. When in fact he was the opposite. He was a tiger trap lined with punji stakes, waiting for somebody to fall in.
So that trap, what were the traps that he laid?
He would find your weak spot and use it against you ruthlessly. And I have a few stories from women that I talked to after the podcast ran, and they basically trace what he was doing in the years before he met Deborah Newell. Mm-hmm. And it's caused me to reevaluate my thinking about the guy. For a while, I thought that he was in it for the money. That's probably one of his motives consistently, but in some of these cases, his motive seemed to be sex and control, sex and domination.
Mm-hmm. Power. That's
power over people, and the pleasure he took in inflicting torment on them. So that comes up over and over. In the first woman that I talked to.
And these women have asked not to be identified, so we don't have audio of them, but
right.
They're going to tell their stories.
There's a South Bay woman. She's a business executive. She dated him in 2009. They met on Match.com. She took the photo of John shirtless at the beach. And he would go to Christmas parties with her. She'd take him to the office Christmas party. He would charm the grandmas. He would charm the kids. He would talk sports with the guys. He was a chameleon. And she says that after about a year of dating him, she got a glimpse of where he lived, which is in this RV park in the desert in Cathedral City.
And he'd been telling her that he was a doctor, right?
He'd been telling her that he had these houses, that he was a success, and she'd never seen where he lived. And when she gets a glimpse of it, she's horrified. She says that he was an extreme hoarder, that it was filled with trash, filled with clothes, filled with piles of dental floss. And she says, let's go our separate ways. We want different things out of life. Let's split up. This is the trigger for her, and he begins terrorizing her. He begins stalking her. He sends her notes saying, I know where you are. And eventually she has to take out a restraining order. One of the chilling things that he does is she gets a 5-year, 500-foot restraining order, and she goes to her window, and there he is, 501 feet away. So he knew exactly how to push right up to the boundary of the law and evade it again and again.
Which is what made it so hard to catch him, because he wasn't breaking the law.
In a lot of cases, he was literally 1 foot away from breaking the law.
Wow.
And she says, he wanted my career destroyed, my body destroyed, my life destroyed. She lost 25 pounds. Her life was terror for a year and a half.
Mm-hmm.
But she gets this restraining order. And after that, he moves on to a Porter Ranch woman that I talked to.
Wow.
This one is particularly sad, I think. She's a single mom in her mid-40s, a pharmaceutical rep, and this takes us up to about 2011. She tells me, he took my sanity and my self-esteem. He turned me into this meek little person. It was a toxic relationship, and I couldn't find the courage to get out. And she says, why do you live in this RV if you're a successful doctor? He says, I like the freedom to travel. I don't like to be tied down to a property. And by the way, you're a gold digger. You're not good enough for me.
He's telling her she's a gold
He's telling
digger.
her this, and this is part of his trick, is he convinces you that you need to prove yourself to be worthy of him. At least he did in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And the other trick he pulled was he tells her, you're a surface person. You don't let people get to know you. What are the ugly things about you that you don't share with people? That's the only way to true intimacy,
Mm-hmm.
he
So
says.
he's data mining.
He's data mining. He's coaxing information out of her that he's going to weaponize. And when she finds messages on his phone that he's dating other women, she says, I'm done. And he begins campaigning to destroy her. So she's out with her daughter, and she gets a call from a friend saying, is everything okay? What are all these awful messages you're posting on Facebook? And he had hacked into her Facebook page and was posting all kinds of awful things, stuff that she had confided in him, stuff about her coworkers. This coworker has STDs. He sends intimate photos of her that he had begged her to send him to her kid's Catholic school. He tells her, you will lose your job, your income, your kids. When I'm done with you, your parents won't want you. And he gives her an ultimatum. He says, the only way I will stop is if you come out to Cathedral City now. I own you for a year. You are my slave for a year. Anytime I want sex, you're going to be there. And because she's terrorized, she gives in, and this is their relationship for many months.
And she's too afraid to say anything to anybody.
She tries to get a restraining order. I think eventually she does. And when she tries to pull away, he sends her texts pretending to be one of his daughters. And he says things like, give my dad another chance. She replies, I need a restraining order against your dad. And Meehan replies back, still in the guise of pretending to be one of his daughters, do you think a piece of paper would stop him? So he seems to know whenever she changes her password, he's probably installed a key logger, a keystroke logger on her keyboard so he can track her movements. Mm-hmm. And I'll just read you a quote that she that she gave me, she says, he'd use every ounce of his deviated brain to come at you. He knew exactly where to hurt you. He wanted to isolate me from friends and family. So your perception is only John's. And she goes to she's a pharmaceutical rep. She happens to be selling antipsychotics, and so she meets a psychiatrist in this context.
Wow.
And he says, this guy needs to believe that he's in control. He needs to believe that he's making the rules. He's not going to just let you go. The thing to do is to make up excuses why you can't see him. Try and put distance between yourself and him. But she's only semi-successful at this. And the only way that she gets away, really, is that he's arrested finally in 2013 for terrorizing still another woman. And this is the Laguna Beach woman.
So yet a third woman who came forward.
And these are only the ones we know about.
Yeah.
These are only the ones that filed restraining orders or talked to me or filed criminal charges against him. I don't know how many others are out there. So the Laguna Beach woman, she's a Brazilian romance novelist, 48 years old, and she's waking up from brain surgery in a hospital in San Diego. And she sees John Meehan above her. He's in doctor's scrubs, and he's got a flip chart. And I talked to an investigator who said he's probably there raiding the rooms for drugs, going from room to room.
Dressed as a doctor.
Dressed as a doctor. He knows the jargon. And I asked, does nobody stop him? Does nobody ask who he is? And the investigator, John Bierling at the DA's office in Orange County, said, look, in 40 years of doing this, what I've learned is that you don't question doctors. Doctors are sacred, and he knows that. Nobody ever questions them. Plus, he knows the jargon. So this is how he meets her. And he says, look, if you have any questions about your case, give me a call. She calls, and they start dating, and he learns that she has some family money and manages to convince her to transfer the money to him to keep it from her soon-to-be ex-husband. But when she hesitates, a friend of hers says, that's kind of a dumb thing to do, you don't want to do that. When she hesitates, he begins terrorizing her too. He steals her passport so she can't leave the country and go back to her family. He sends her photos of her house and from inside her house to let her know that he's been there, that he's watching her. And she tells the Laguna Beach PD. They investigate, and this is when they do a search of his desert storage unit in Cathedral City, and they find cyanide, they find zip ties, and they find a gun. And I asked the investigator, what could he want with this? He said he was probably going to take her money and kill her. Wow. Tie up loose ends, right? But this is what sends him to prison. And this takes us up to mid-2014, which is when he gets out of prison. Soon after, he meets Deborah Newell, and we all know how that story goes.
Exactly. Now, after the podcast was released, you also spoke to Meehan's children from his marriage to Tanya Bales.
Right, Emily and Abigail. I was particularly curious about this because Meehan always talked about how his ex-wife had wronged him, how vicious she was for keeping him from his children, what a great father he was. He would pose with his kids on dating sites, on the profile picture.
So using them as props, like I'm a good father.
Right, kind of using them as props. And I was curious what kind of relationship he actually had with them. And it turns out almost none. And so Abigail Meehan, she's 18 years old, a high school senior in Georgia now, and she hadn't had contact with him in maybe 10 years and has only a few memories of him. And we have some audio of Abigail.
Hearing like the threats that he would make to my mom and stuff, like I was always scared of him. I always thought that he was gonna come and like hurt my mom or try to kidnap me. In the mornings before school, even in high school, like 16, 17-year-old girl, I would be so scared in the morning when it's pitch black that he would be in my car when I was going out to my car to drive to school. I would just have the most like irrational fears that he's like waiting for me or he's gonna like show up to my school and like try to take me. Like I was just always so scared. I still think about him every single day, and I hate that my life is centered around it. But I would just want him to know, I would want him to know all my accomplishments, and I would want him to like feel bad for missing out on my whole life, you know? I thought that dying was like the easy way out, that he got killed and he didn't have to suffer for what he was going to do or plan to do or past things that he has done. I thought that he should be in jail for the rest of his life, and that's what he deserves. Tara did what she had to do. Like, I have nothing against Tara, but I would rather him have survived it and then been put in jail and just had to suffer in jail.
Abigail is in the audience with us tonight, so please give her a round of applause. She's a wonderful young woman, very smart.
I just want to read one thing she told me. She said, I look like my mom, and I have her brain and her heart, and he just helped create me, and I don't have any of his traits.
Now, you also spoke with Emily, Abigail's sister.
Right. She's 22, and she remembers being a little girl, and he'd get visitations with her. He'd be right out of jail. And she remembers him taking her to Chuck E. Cheese, and he would bring a trash bag full of toys and trinkets that he'd buy at the dollar store, knickknacks, board games, things like that. And we have some audio of her also.
Well, at first, he was still my dad, and I still wanted to see him, and I was excited to see him. I do remember that, and kind of asking my mom where he was, and sometimes he would promise me these lavish gifts, and one time he promised me a laptop, and I sat by my front door for 3 days waiting for the mail and the UPS man to come, and my mom actually had to write a letter to my teacher because I did not do any of my homework because I was so fixated on these promises that would never come. He would tell me he was going to take me to Disney World, that he was going to fly us to California to be with his family, and just all these little tales. He had two little girls. He has 2 girls, you know, and I wondered if it ever crossed his mind. I wonder how the men in my daughter's life are treating them right now. And I mean, thankfully, no one has treated me other than him like that. But I do wonder if that ever crossed his mind.
It's a really poignant statement.
Now, Emily is going to be a nurse anesthetist like her mom. And one thing both sisters told me is that they have a terrific stepdad who's been a father figure to them. And in a story that's otherwise extremely grim, I think that's one of the bright spots.
Amazing. So before we let you go, we have you up here on stage. We solicited questions from readers online in advance of the event, and so I went to high school in Orange County, in Irvine, actually, and so I have a requisite Orange County question. So reader Sandra Mayhew asks, what is it about the character or nature of Orange County that contributes to these shocking stories? Just thought we'd end on a light note.
Somebody told me my beat should be called Psychosis in the Suburbs. It happens to be where I live and work. And if I lived and worked in Bend, Oregon, people would say a lot of twisted stuff was coming out of there. Because that's where that's what I write about. But I think there's also, it's a big, diverse county, and there's also some wealth there. And I wish I could give you a better answer than that. The one I did before this was framed about the case in Irvine with the lawyers planting the drugs. I think there's this deep interest in what goes on beneath the surface of a seemingly idyllic suburban setting. So,
thank you so much, Christopher.
Thank you.
Let's give him a hand.